Lynn Hartley, this is fantastic. Jackson Center purposes, you were the guy personally responsible for obtaining for the Jackson Center from Allegheny County the transcripts of the International Military Tribunal. How did that all come to be?
That was very circumstantial. It's another case being in the right place at the right time, I guess. I had been assigned to work as a judicial hearing officer in Allegheny County. I did that for about 10, 11 years. And going down there, got to know the folks down there very well. And Judge Jim Mukin one day happened to come up to me and he said, "Hey, do you know anything about this Jackson Center over in Jamestown?" I said, "Well, I think I happen to know a little bit about it." Yeah, I was sort of tangentially involved in the original sale of the building and property that had belonged to the Jamestown Consistory, of which, as you know, Justice Jackson had been a member. And I said, "I do." And he said, "Well, is there anybody, could you talk to somebody and see if they might be interested in something that I think we've got over here?" And I said, "Oh, what's that?" And he said, "Well, we happen to have a complete set of the trial transcripts in German, original German and English translations." He said, I think we might be missing 1 or 2 volumes, but other than that, I think it's the whole thing." And I said, "I think I know the man who to talk to." And a phone call later, and one ride later, carrying several boxes full of books. I think you and I hauled that into the Jackson Center.
And it came in a few weeks before Rehnquist came here. You may not remember that, but it was really, the timing was unbelievable to have a bookcase. And the bookcase we got from Jim Sommer. I don't know if you remember Jim up in Fredonia.
Oh, certainly. Calisano, Sommer, and Daly.
That's right.
Yes.
And so we were part of that firm at the time, Phillips Lytle was, and Jim had this beautiful glass bookcase, and he said, "Why don't you take that?" So with your books that you got from Allegheny, that bookcase, that became something we could showcase literally to Rehnquist.
That part I did not know, but that's amazing.
And I think just for the camera, we worked with the corporate counsel for Allegheny County because they had they had a desire to get rid of it, but they had a hard time figuring out how to.
Exactly. I remember talking to the county attorney, and if I recall correctly, your memory is probably better than mine at this point, but I think we worked out if it was not an indefinite lease period, it was certainly a very lengthy
That's right.
period of time that Allegheny County leased that set of books to the Jackson Center for the grand sum of $1.
That's right. Oh, you got a great memory. That's exactly what happened. They said couldn't gift it. The whole idea was we can't gift it, even though it was sitting, I think, in a garage someplace.
It was sitting in a building at their landfill that people were considering getting rid of it. They were literally going to toss it in their landfill. Is what was going to happen to it.
Oh, yeah. So anyways, Lynn Hartley, folks, he's the guy that created and made available to us that whole thing. Was law part of your early growing up? Was anybody in your family lawyers?
No. It's not I was the first to go to college issue at all. Both of my parents had gone to college, and aunts and uncles and all that, but no one had gone beyond college in any professional way. And I certainly did not start out that way. I started out at Allegheny as a math major, not entirely of my own choosing, but I guess I happened to do well in high school, and somebody thought that would be a good major for me. Well, when I got to college, that quickly changed. And I became, and I always had been very interested in history. So that became my primary major in college. And I had actually signed up to go through advanced ROTC. In those days, Allegheny College had 2-year mandatory ROTC, and it was Air Force ROTC. And I had been selected for what they call the advanced program, which, as you know, you come out a second lieutenant with your college degree. Well, over the summer between my sophomore and junior year, I got thinking, and I decided that I didn't want to teach history as a lifelong career, and didn't really want to see myself going on to, get an advanced degree in history. And so I started, well, what can I do with a history degree? I can go to law school. So that's what I decided to do, thinking it would probably be used more likely as an entryway into the business world of some sort. Well, after my second year in law school, I was looking around for a summer job, and my aunt was at the time married to George Matthews, who was the owner of the old Matthews and Miller's men's store that had been around here for many years at that time. George happened to be Justice of the Peace in the town of North Harmony, and had gotten to know Bill Cass. And my grandfather had been friends with J. Russell Rogerson, well-known, another gentleman in the composite we'll look at. But my Uncle George said, "Oh, you want somebody young like Bill Cass, and he's looking for somebody, I understand." So they gave me his number, and as they say, the rest is history. I called Bill up, and he offered me a summer job that one summer. And after I finished law school, I was offered a job in Buffalo, and then one here with Bill, and I decided to take the one here and come back home.
So I'm not sure I knew that whole story. Was it Cass and Cass at the time? Was his dad still?
No, Bill. I don't believe Bill ever practiced with his father.
Okay.
When he started practicing, shortly after the tax attorney position opened up, and I don't remember who it was at the time, but it was either the local state senator or assemblyman wanted to get him that job. But one of the conditions was that he had to have an office uptown in the city. So he obtained, at the time, Adolph Johnson had not too long before lost his prior partner and had a space opened in the Wellman building. So that's when Bill came uptown into the downtown area and opened up his office in the Wellman building, and so that's where I started. And the first day I got here, I think we went down to, at the time, Sears Roebuck was down where the Post-Journal is now. And we went down, and he bought a card table, opened it up in his office, and that was my desk. That's what I started out, my first desk in practicing law.
What kind of law was it? Was it family, domestic relations type law, or just general?
Will did anything and everything that brought clients into the office. So a lot of it was matrimonial, family law. We did a lot of V&T work, both in the courts and the motor vehicle hearings. Did a lot of those. And with Adolph Johnson, we started to get some estate work, gradually worked into some small business work. We had a client, a fellow by the name of Jerry Hall, who was quite an entrepreneur in the city at the time, and we did a lot of work for him. And he would build buildings and then either sell or lease them out. I remember I think it was the Volkswagen dealership when it came into town at the time, did the work for him on that down on Washington Street. It was one of the bigger deals that we did for him.
Oh, now, how long were you with Judge Cass, or Bill Cass at that?
I started with Bill the summer of '66. I worked for him for that summer. And then I graduated in '67 and came to work with for Bill in. I wasn't scheduled actually to come to work for Bill until probably sometime in September, but after I got through with the bar exam, my best friend in law school, he and I went up to Canada for the Expo '67 was going on in Montreal at that time, and by the time I got home, I was literally so broke that I called him up and asked him if I could start work the next week. So that's what I did.
And at some point, Bill actually then decided he'd run for court, right?
I think that was Bill's plan. As long as I can remember knowing him, that was his plan, was to run for the judiciary. And in fact, that's, I guess, what really got me involved in local politics when Judge Palmer, the then family court judge, retired. They were going to have what would have been the first election for a family court judge. Judge Palmer had originally been the children's court judge, which I'm pretty sure I was appointed, not an elected position. But then when the Family Court Act was enacted, all sitting children's court judges in the state were automatically termed to be family court judges. So Judge Palmer was actually the family court judge then. His chief clerk was John Hollenbeck, attorney in Dunkirk. And at that time, that was a part-time job. And of course, the court was run by the county originally. And then the state took over the unified court system, and all courts from the city courts up became part of that system and were then state employees. But the county level judges were still elected in their own county geographical area. So when Judge Palmer retired, there was going to be a race for his position, and Bill was one of the candidates that was very actively working for it. So he heard that there was a vacancy on the county Republican committee in the town of Busti where I was living. As when I came here, my grandparents lived there, and I lived with them for a while until they decided they were going to move into another apartment building they had and downsize themselves. So I bought that house and was just outside the village in the town of Busti. And he called up a friend of his who was the town chairman, Nell Tarbreak, who was a longtime teacher at Southwestern, and another protege of, Dale Robbins, I believe, was another one of her proteges that she worked an awful lot for. But I got to meet Nell, and she very graciously accepted me on the committee. So that's how I got involved, so that Bill would have another vote in the county committee race to decide who would be the Republican candidate for Judge Palmer's position. Well, as it turned out, Judge Hollenbeck came out on top in that vote, and much to his credit, and just the way Bill was the first one to get up and move that the vote be one unanimous vote for Judge Hollenbeck, and he backed right off. And he, by doing that, he pretty much was guaranteed whatever the next judicial position was going to be, it was going to go to him. That turned out to be Judge Phillips' position as the surrogate. He retired, and again, the rest was history with Bill.
So how long then were you with Cass? Was that just sound like it was a pretty short period of time, wasn't it?
It was. I started to work full-time with him in late August of '67, and Bill became surrogate judge, I believe, in 1972. But the real reason that Bill Cass wanted somebody to come and work for him at that time was he had a trip to Africa planned. That he and a good friend, a fellow by the name of Ray Nelson, were already planning to go on a long-awaited safari over to Africa. And Bill needed somebody to not only run the office, but to handle the work as the county estate tax attorney. And so one of the members of the state tax commission had been a professor of mine at Syracuse. And so Bill called him up and worked out a deal that I was appointed as an unpaid acting commissioner for this sole purpose of going around and inventorying the safe deposit boxes, which in those days all had to be inventoried when anybody passed.
I remember that procedure, crazy as it was a procedure. And then, you joined with Al Ford, didn't you? Was that the next step? No?
No, I was on my own. There were a couple of folks that talked to me, but I decided to stay on my own, and which I did for about 3 years.
Yep.
And then Richard Fessenden and I had become friends. Mm-hmm. And he had originally been a school teacher, and we met when we were both ski patrolling at the old Eagle Ridge ski resort up there, but just outside of Mayville. And after a couple of years, he went back to law school, and I think his first year back, he actually worked up at Joe Gerassi's office. And then Joe was elected the county executive, and Dick and I talked, and we got together until I was elected in '78.
So being on the prosecution, or being on the private side of the ledger, is there an incident or two, a story or two, where you'd say, Greg, you're not going to believe this, without naming names that may be kind of unusual, because you did litigation.
I did. Okay, I'm going to have to. That wasn't one of the things I was thinking about before I came over here. I was trying to.
It later, it's always a curiosity, because when you get together at bar picnics, people talk stories, and one thing leads to another, saying, do you remember this one? Remember this one? So if it comes to mind, it's always good to kind of capture.
Well, I can think of one where I had a client who had been arrested for a DWI charge. And he was an insurance broker business. And the DA's office was, the test was, there was no accident involved, and it was a relatively low test. And back in those days, the test results were a little higher than they are now anyway. And they had agreed to a driving while impaired, but the client said that any kind of drinking offense would likely cost him his license. So I went and talked to the district attorney, who was Bob Seidel, covering the court that this was in, and I won't mention which court it was. And he agreed to reduce the charge. It was not really a reduction, but he agreed to reduce it to a reckless driving, which is an unclassified misdemeanor under the vehicle and traffic law. But it was one that the client, after checking, found would not affect his license, because it did not, was not actually a drinking offense, an alcohol-related offense. Well, we went to the judge who was presiding on the case, and he wouldn't agree to accept the plea to the recommended charge that the DA had made. So Bob said, well, there's not much I can do. So I had to think and try and figure out how we could take care of this. Well, I ended up making a motion to have the local magistrate recused, and took it before Judge Lee Town Adams. And he readily granted it.
Really?
He said his position was, well, if the DA knows his case is much better than anybody else, and if he feels that's an appropriate disposition of the case, then your motion is granted, and the matter was moved to a different court, and we settled the matter.
That's a great story. I'm going to.
I can think of one other one.
Sure.
If you have a minute. Another case with Bob Seidel, and I don't know if you remember Harry Johnson.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
as they refer to A.E. Hangin' Harry Johnson.
Yes,
You know, he
yes.
spoke with a very, very deep Swedish brogue. I had a young man that was charged with unlicensed and uninsured operation. So it was there was a misdemeanor involved, so he was entitled to counsel. So by that time, I was a public defender and got assigned to the case. And it was a case where Bob felt he was pretty much boxed in because they had been getting a lot of complaints from the neighborhood of individuals racing up and down the streets in the locality. So we went to trial on the case, and it was a night trial, of course. And Bob called in several witnesses that claimed that they saw my client driving the vehicle, and my client's defense was that he was not driving. And he had a witness that testified to that it was not my client, but when asked who was driving, he took the Fifth Amendment. And to save Bob some considerable time, I stipulated that he had two or three other witnesses. He had already put 2 or 3 on that were going to testify to essentially the same facts. And case goes to the jury, and by this time, it's well after midnight. Jury comes back not guilty. And so the client and I stand up, and the judge is up there, and if you've ever appeared in front of Harry, and he was a real interesting character, one of those that, you know, you don't forget. He sat there, and he was so flustered. He says, okay, you can go this time, but don't let it happen again. So off we went, and as it happened, the very next morning, Bob and I were scheduled to try a jury trial in city court in front of the Les Berglund at that time. And this was right at 9:30, first thing in the morning. We came in and Bob came up to me and said, "What do you want?" Here's what I can do. So after last night, I'm in no mood to try one today, so.
That's great. Hey, I'm going to show you the composite here. This is 1967. You were the first kid on the block. And I'll just put it in front of you. And if as you go through that, Lynn, if you got any sort of comments, anything that reflects as you see a name, just give me a name and say, this guy did this, or here's a funny story or a vignette, anything along that line, because you're the youngest guy in the composite, and frankly, there aren't many still among us.
Unfortunately, that is true. Judge Fancher, of course, was at that time our Supreme Court justice, and he was already on the bench when I came. But I remember a story as to how he got his position, because as anybody that's familiar with that system, Erie County basically controls, and this is regardless both Republican and Democratic sides, Erie County can outvote all the other counties in the 8th Judicial District combined. And for some reason, they had agreed that year that there would be a seat on the Supreme Court that would go outside of Erie County. And I don't recall who the other contender was, but apparently they took a vote of all the chairmen of the counties outside of Erie County, and Judge Fancher won that vote. So when Erie County's term came to vote, they put all their votes behind Judge Fancher, and that's how he was able to get on the bench. A terrific judge. And McKinley Phillips, Mac Phillips, was a tremendous gentleman. That, of course, that was who Bill Cass succeeded. And I recall, I think one of the biggest cases that he probably had that a lot of people probably don't remember is he had the case involving the property assessments at Chautauqua Institute.
Okay, yeah.
And what would be considered tax exempt as religious or cultural non-profit properties, what would not be tax exempt, and what might be a mix of the two. And from what I understand, that decision went up to the appellate division, and Judge Phillips was affirmed all the way on that.
Wow.
So
That's huge. That is huge.
That was quite an interesting case that he had, definitely. And Sherwood Cadwell, I'm sure is one that you are very familiar with. I don't know the entire story of how Phillips Lytle and Sherry got together, but I remember Sherry and Bob Sharp were together here many years, and
Bob, a very young guy named Greg Peterson.
Yes, and I remember that. When you came, you and your wife Cindy had been in school with my brother at Allegheny.
Yep.
Right? Al Ford, I do remember when I started practicing, Al was Stan Lundeen, Ford and Lundeen. They were, Bill and I were on the 4th floor of the Wellman building, right off the elevator, and Al and Stan were right around the corner. So that was a real hot spot for the bar in the Wellman building in those days. Phil Erickson was right above us. Jeff Weesey, who I know is in here, Jeff I had met in law school at Syracuse. He was 2 years ahead of me, and he and I got to be good friends. He was from the Mayville area originally, and so when I came to work with Bill, we reacquainted, and so I got to know Jeff very well. The Wright brothers, Clive, who we knew as Bud Wright, was a longtime ADA that handled a lot of the town courts and had a lot of work with him. Wayne Herrick was the social services attorney for many years. Al McKee, after Wayne retired, became social services attorney either right about the same time that I was first elected to family court. And a little story about Al, he came in to see me in the office up there in Mayville one day, and he comes in and sits down and says, "Judge, I want to talk to you." I said, whoa, Al, no, it's Lynn. We've known each other for 10 plus years. I said, "No, we're up here, you're the judge. I'm the attorney." He said, I haven't been around family court much at all. I don't know a whole lot about the Family Court Act, but I think I know my way around the courtroom. Al, of course, had been a defense lawyer, I think primarily for most of his career, so he was certainly well acquainted with the courtroom. And he came in and he said, "I don't know much about the Family Court Act, but I can promise you this. When we file a case, that case is going to be mine, and I'll make the decisions on the case and what happens with them." So we both agreed that that would be just fine, and we always got along very, very well when he was up there.
Yeah.
Jim Abdullah, I was president of the bar and put Jim in line to be president, and fortuitously, when Jim was president, unfortunately, his very good friend Bill Arison passed. And he told me later that he was always grateful that I had done that, and that he was in a position to be able to honor his friend Bill Arison at that particular time. Bill had been the one that originally appointed me to assistant public defender position at that time. George Rogers was not in the Jamestown bar. I think he was in the Northern bar, but George Rogers had been the original public defender when that system was created by the county. And he only had it for a very short time, because by the time I came to work for Bill Arison was the public defender, and it was Bill and Stan Lundeen. And Bill was desperately looking for particularly a younger attorney, and one that wouldn't mind traveling, because he needed coverage in mostly the town courts. So it took a while, because there was some trading going on, or some, I think politics got involved, because Bill was, I don't think Bill was an enrolled Democrat, but he was a very liberal thinking person. And so there were those at the then Board of Supervisors was still running the county, and they apparently somebody put the block to my appointment until Bill Cass found out what was going on. And after a phone call or two, suddenly I was finally appointed as an assistant public defender. And I remember Bill Arison saying that you may not always practice criminal law, he said, but what you learn here will get you through any courtroom that you want to go into. And he was right. At the time, Bill and Stan Lundeen handled the felony cases in the county. I represented all misdemeanors in the county.
My gosh.
So I was covering every town court, village court, and the 2 city courts.
Oh, my God.
They were all mine.
Oh, my gosh. Lynn.
Yeah, and John Goodell, of course, was someone that I practiced with quite a bit. His brother Charles, I met on a couple of occasions. I certainly did not know him real well. He and Bill Cass had been very good friends. Papa Cass, I always called him, Willard Sr., he and Tubi Scarpino, Mike Lombardo, and a couple others, Lucian, Ledestro, those were the ones that I really felt they were the true legends in their own times. And, there aren't very many of those around anymore.
Tell me about Mike Lombardo. I mean, I've heard, our paths crossed for a couple of years. I'd go to city court, and he was the icon, very old though at the time. So what was he like?
Mike was very, very easy and outgoing. At the time that I started, Dobby Burgett had just started with them, I think the year before. It was Lombardo and Sellstrom, and I'm not sure when it became Lombardo, Sellstrom, and Burgett, but I think Dalton had started the year before I did. Then I came. Jeff had started the year before Dalton. So there were several years there in a row where one of us left and it seemed like one of our senior citizens passed at the same time. So we were staying pretty even. But Mike was just a tremendously outgoing, personable fella, old-time lawyer, just like Willard, no nonsense, but very, very easy to get to know and to work with. Two that I really remember and enjoying, especially once I went on the bench, were 2 gentlemen from the North County, Bert Snyder and Tony Spann. And I can remember some of the very best cases that I ever had that went to trial were with those 2 gentlemen. I mean, they were like hammer and tong, tooth and nail, oil and water in the courtroom. I mean, neither one of them let the other one get away with anything, but they knew the law, and they knew their cases, and they knew what they were doing. But boy, you would think that they just totally hated each other, and nothing could have been farther from the truth. I mean, as soon as they were out of the courtroom, it was all left in the courtroom. And unfortunately, there are too many times, I think, even in these days, where that doesn't happen. But with gentlemen like that, it really did.
Did you ever get, and you don't have to necessarily name names, of course, if you want to, that'd be great, where you were acting in judge, and maybe in a capacity as family court, acting Supreme Court, acting circuit court, something where the emotions reached such a fever pitch, you were worried that it might lead to some physical altercation, where it just got so much finger pointing, or even their clients that are sitting there, it just got tense?
Yes, I can remember occasions where that did happen. I had, when I was on the bench, I had a very, very good friend, Frank Mizwa, who was a retired sheriff's deputy, who was one of my regular court officers. Unlike Buffalo, we were not assigned specific officers, but certain ones worked with certain judges more often than others, and Frank was one that worked with me quite a bit, especially in the courtroom. And he had a nice long talk with me one time, shortly after I started, and he said, I keep an eye on your neckline. He said, when the color starts coming up, he said, I know it's time, just look at me. And when Frank gave me the look, it was time to take a recess. So we would, and that would usually settle things down. But so that's something that I followed, tried to follow with most of the cases I had that would get to a position like that. When they really get going at each other, we would take a recess and let things cool off, and it usually worked.
Did Frank or anybody else, I've seen this happen occasionally, where things get tense in the courtroom and all of a sudden the court security would just sort of stand up, not do anything other than sort of stand up, and everybody would just sort of look, and he did nothing other than stand up, which he could do.
Very, very often, yes, quite a bit. Two of the deputies that I can remember doing that quite a bit were Roger Ball and Moose Peters. They were both very good at that, and at watching the people in the courtroom and knowing who to be careful about. And yes, they were very good at doing that. And they would just very casually, not make a big deal out of it, very quietly, very casually. If it was really continuing, they would just slowly walk up and would be right behind the person standing there, and all of a sudden they would realize, oh, okay, I think maybe I need to stop what I'm doing, and that usually took care of it.
Let me ask a question, which I probably will, I might edit out later on, but I remember a conversation you had, and I think Judge Cass at the same time, because Cindy worked, my wife, Cindy worked for Judge Cass, was the number of the lawyers who are Masons, and getting involved with the Masonic fraternity, and as a lawyer, not a bad thing to do. Was that a sense that you had that for lawyers to just get engaged, in which you are still, and as am I, just as that particular fraternity as a professional group?
Well, Bill was certainly probably responsible directly for me to join. However, my grandfather had been a Mason, but I never knew that until he passed. And my first real connection was at his funeral when they held the Masonic service for him. But I had a great uncle who had been the potentate of Ishmaelia Temple in Buffalo. He was very active when I was, very young and still in high school. We'd always go to the shrine circus and all that. But I never equated Masonry with the shrine in those days. That you had to be a Mason in order to be a Shriner. And in fact, in those days, you had to not only be a Mason, you had to either be a Scottish Rite Mason or a York Rite Mason. So that has changed. But I think that I recall Bill Cass talking about when Judge Fancher, he had been the commander-in-chief at the consistory. He was very active in getting attorneys involved in Masonry. And I don't look at it as something that I did thinking that was going to help me in business or to help me specifically get ahead. Did it create friendships and acquaintanceships that with people that did do things for me and help me in many different ways? Yes, I would say it did, certainly. But that wasn't really the reason why I did it. But specifically joining Carroll Lodge was at Bill's request, because that was his home lodge.
Sure.
But it's been a very nice group to have been a member of. but I know a lot of people, think a lot of sinister things about it, and none of that, and certainly in my experience, has ever been the case. And there have been a lot of very, very good officials, public officials, that have been involved in masonry, as there have been many who were not Masons. So, but it certainly does, especially as I was when I came to town, trying to get known, to be able to bring in practice. And at least that's the way I was taught. The only way you're going to get people to come in the door is if they know who is on the other side of that door when they walk in. And I think that also led to my involvement to many other activities. I was in the Lakewood area JCs for many years. Was involved in the Lakewood area Junior Miss pageant. I actually incorporated that program, and as some of us realized that it was not going to, that we hoped that was something that would outlive the Lakewood JCs, which fortunately it did.
Yeah. You being a member of the Scottish Rite Consistory, and the Scottish Rite Consistory owned the facility, which is now the Robert Jackson Center, and I was intimately involved in the acquisition of the building, which is a whole 2-hour story, but dealt with the Carlton Winchesters, and as to whether they were going to be willing to sell it. There was an offer at the time.
That's right.
I got involved, and really Judge Cass and his friendship with Betty Lene sort of stopped that sale to give us enough time to make a presentation.
Yeah.
And do you remember some of that?
I certainly do. I had just recently been the Commander-in-Chief. I don't remember the exact year that
This was 2000. The year 2000 is when there was an offer, and we sort of started monkeying around with the Jackson Center.
Okay.
And the actual sale occurred early 2001.
I was still involved on the board of the consistory, so yes, I was well aware of what was going on, and the offer that had been made did not guarantee us any continued use there. So it was actually a situation where it was almost a matter of necessity for us to come to the decision to finally sell that property after so many years that it had been owned by the consistory. So when the group of yourself and the others that put that program all together, I remember we were really very, very grateful that not only would it be something to honor someone like Jackson, but the connection between us and Jackson. In fact, we had been donated, I think, some of his Masonic memorabilia while I was Commander-in-Chief, that we had obtained one of the furniture companies had donated a cabinet to display those items in.
It's spectacular. I remember seeing that. It's still there. Was there much? I know I remember. This should be or not on the record, but let's talk about it. I was Bill Daly had put in the other offer to turn it into a teleconference center.
Yes, I didn't remember the name, but yes, I do remember that.
And I didn't know right up front when it initially got started. I said, Stan Weeks had encouraged me to stop by. I talked to Carl Winchester. He said there was an offer, and I said, okay, I'll put in an offer personally, and an amount that'll equal. I never put in an amount because I didn't even know what the other guy was. hoping against hope that Carl Kappa and Betty Linnae would find this of interest. Anyways, we actually made a presentation jointly, he first, then me, and you're right, the distinction was, we're going to give you the same amount of money, whatever that was, but you could stay. You know, and we're on,
Yep.
by the way, we're honoring a 33rd degree Mason, you know, on top of everything else. So
Right.
I think the question was probably, and I'm curious was whether to sell or not so much to who to sell it to, but you know, whether there was a question of hanging on to it for a while.
My recollection is that, I mean, that was a question that had been discussed and debated for many years. And one of the biggest difficulties we had was that we were not able to be a nonprofit organization. So we had to rely on basically dues and any fundraising that we were able to do to maintain the property, the expenses of the property, heating the property, and taxes. That was one of the biggest expenses that was really getting to the point that really made it difficult for us to actually hold on to the property. So it was not a decision that was easily made, considering the long history. I think that my recollection is correct that it went back to somewhere in the 1920s.
Exactly 1920. Yeah. So yeah, that was a fascinating time, and here we are. We're now the Jackson Center celebrating its 20th anniversary this year because of your actions, Judge. The charge was led, and they made the vote, and we bought the building, and that too is history.
And I do remember the day we did vote on that. I was there for that. Yes.
So it was fascinating. So you came in with a notebook, and were there questions that you were anticipating that we'd be asking here, Judge?
I tried to think of some things that if there were of interest,
Sure.
but
what haven't I covered here? What haven't we covered, I should say?
I think some of the things that, as far as what personally brought me here, is, I think you probably remember, I was actually born here. My father's family had long lived here in the Jamestown area. My grandfather was an Englishman, and my grandmother was first or second generation Swedish American. My grandmother and my great grandmother used to argue with each other in Swedish, so that nobody in the family could understand them. That used to be a family got a kick out of that. And my dad had been very active in Little Theater. In fact, my dad was written up. I've got a copy of it was in the Little Theater program for one of their shows back in the probably late 40s. My dad passed in 1945 in the Philippines, but while he was still in France, he had sent in a donation to a building fund. Because at that time, the Little Theater had what was the old Howard Johnson's, where Brajota's is now. And apparently they had been discussing a building fund or of some kind, and my dad sent a check to them, which they recognized as the first donation to their building fund. And I meant to bring a copy of that, but I have to locate that. My dad was William Derwood Hartley, and you always knew whether somebody knew him from something like the service or whether it was a hometown. In the service, everybody knew him as Bill, but in Jamestown, he was Durwood to everybody. He went to high school here, but ironically, he did not graduate from Jamestown because that was right in the midst of the Depression, and my grandparents moved out to California. They were only out there for 1 or 2 years, but that's where my dad actually graduated high school, out there. Then came back and went. I didn't realize that he had apparently, Alfred must have had some kind of program where he got some of his college done here through Alfred, and then went to Denison and completed his degree at Denison. My mother had gone to RIT, which at that time was only a 2-year school. Mm-hmm. She came to Jamestown after she finished school and was head of it was a house for young women where they not only lived, but she would teach them homemaking life skills. At that time, it was part of the Roosevelt New Deal programs, and they met. She had been very active in her church in Buffalo, and so she came to the one down here. My dad had been very active in the First Baptist Church here in Jamestown, and that's where they initially met and got together. And, so they were married just, I think, November of '41, just before Pearl Harbor. And they lived here, and I was born here. My dad was older, so he was, at that time in the war, not in the draftable age, and then was married, and once my mother became pregnant, they weren't drafting, at least at that point, but he volunteered and enlisted and went to boot camp in Fort Niagara, leaving in May of '43, so it was just a few months after I was born. I was born in February, and so I've got a few pictures of him, but my first real recollection of him was literally the day they brought his body back from
Did they explain
the
much
Philippines.
what happened to him?
Yes, it was. He spent most of his time in France. He went overseas just before Easter of 1944. He had been in New York, and in fact, I've got a letter from my mother that wrote to him saying that she was going to come down and surprise him for Easter, show him her new Easter bonnet she wrote about. But my grandfather had been, he was the postmaster on the rail car. Mail in those days mostly traveled by rail, and he was on the main line, New York Central, run from Buffalo to New York, and would be gone for a week, and then he'd be home for a week. He got down to New York, and he would usually look up my dad. Well, all of a sudden he was gone. They didn't give him a phone call to make.
No.
When they left, they just left. So he went over to England, and I think probably somewhere around Easter time in 1944. Then went to France, received his field commission to second lieutenant, and after Germany surrendered, his outfit was transferred to the Philippines. They went through the canal, and shortly after they cleared the canal, Harry dropped the bomb, and they circled for 2 or 3 days, I guess, and then half the convoy got sent home, and the other half sent on to the Philippines to relieve the many forces that were over there. And he became very ill out in the middle of the jungle. They had a field hospital set up, and I had a chance many years ago to talk to his company sergeant, who also became one of his best friends, and we remained close to them till he passed. And I actually got to see the location where he was in 1976. I was sitting in my office in the Wellman building, and I received a phone call from Dick Kimball's father, who we had done some work for, and he answered the phone, and the first thing he says is, "Lynn, how'd you like to go to the Philippines?" And he knew nothing about my background, so it really took me more than by surprise. Turned out he was president of the local Rotary Club, and they were in the process of looking for a team to send to the Philippines as part of what Rotary sponsors, the Rotary Group Study Exchange Program. And you had to be a non-Rotarian, and so I said absolutely, and then I told him the story, and I applied, and I was fortunate enough to be accepted for that program. And in those days, it took me away from the office for 2 months. We went to the Philippines, and I had the good fortune to, because when you're over there, you stay with local members of the Rotary, and the first household I stayed in was a retired Air Force colonel who had been pilot of Air Force One for Harry Truman. And retired colonels still, even though they're retired, carry a lot of juice. I had the information on where my father was buried, but no idea where in the world that was. So he took the information I had, contacted Clark Air Force Base, and the next day I knew at least the city where it had been, and we happened to be scheduled to go there 2 days later. And so we went there, and after the Rotary meeting that we attended, I asked the gentleman that was my host driving me for the day if he would mind helping me find this particular location. It was a little barrio or village. And the other members of the group normally get taken on tours of local businesses and to show them how they're all the things that they're doing and so on. But of course everybody on the team knew my history and the story, and they all wanted to go too. So there are about 4 or 5 carloads of us and these Filipinos driving around the countryside in northern Luzon looking for the place that had been the cemetery where my father had been buried. Where he had actually died, the hospital was on the grounds that was now a airport for one of the larger cities in the northern part of the Philippines. And so we found, not only did we find where the cemetery had been, the little building that was used as a chapel was still there, still used by the local villagers, and we found it on my birthday.
Wow, wow.
So that was probably one of the more emotional moments of my life in the travels that I've had.
Over this here. Wow, that's a fantastic story. Did he sense he had malaria? Is that what it said?
He developed pneumonia. He got pneumonia, and then developed kidney stones. And he was literally, as his friend Mike DiMartino, he's another story altogether. His family owned a fish market in New York City. So I have a lot of fish stories out of that. But Mike said that he literally had been so sick they couldn't even transport him from that hospital down to Manila, where they might have been able to treat him and possibly save him, but didn't make it.
That's a hell of a story. I'm going to segue, just because I have you here. Two things. One, it's a personal thing. I can say that you occasionally would call me and ask me to be a law guardian. And I would always remonstrate and say, look, I have no clue. I'm not a litigator. I don't go to court. You're bringing, what are you doing to me? And he said, no, Greg, you're very nice. He said, I really just want somebody who can act as a law guardian to be kind of a Solomon. Listen, you don't have to make the objections. You don't have to do all the procedural things, but you used me. And I appreciated that because I felt maybe there was some effectiveness having somebody who was brought in who wasn't caught up in the procedure. It was more the substance. Listen to both sides and see if you can basically make sense out of it all. And I tell you that not for, you don't have to respond, but I remember you using me to that extent.
And I appreciate the help that you gave. There were some that were not so willing.
Well, I must tell you, in all candor, I was thrilled when they had the requirement that you had to go through a class to be certified, because I felt that was a good exit strategy for me, not to do that. But the other thing was, you were here as part of an event where we had Professor Sept, and it was a play that was being read by Professor Fredonia on the life of William O. Douglas. And you were on Allegheny College campus at the time when Justice Douglas was there. And I know with your laughter, you can tell the rest of the story.
Well, you tell it so much better than I do, though, Craig. Justice Douglas came to Allegheny and spoke there. And one of the young ladies that heard him speak was also, I believe, a political science major, and had, I believe she had already done some studying about him, but after he was there, she proceeded to do a lot more studying on Justice Douglas, and even went down to Washington, if I recall correctly, and did some, I don't know if she was actually an intern, but she did do some studying there, and certainly got to know Justice Douglas much better than any of us had anticipated that she was going to, as they ended up getting married not too many years after that occurred. And yes, I had known her. She had dated one of my fraternity brothers before Justice Douglas. So I guess he didn't feel too left out, having lost out to the Supreme Court justice. But
I remember the story. And interestingly enough, just for the record, you can look at YouTube. It's a speech given by Professor Robert Sept about that visit of Douglas and the relationship that ensued. And in fact, you can go down to Allegheny College. They have the comp that she wrote on Justice Douglas, her research project.
Yeah. And if I recall correctly, he later divorced her to marry an even younger young lady.
That's right. Allegheny College, Lynn Hartley, he was there. Do you remember, did you go to the presentation at all? Do you remember anything of Douglas being on campus? Did that mean anything?
Not a whole lot. I mean, certainly not to the extent that it got to her, but I remember that he was there and had spoken there. Yeah, we had a lot going on down there for a small school.
What's the question I should be asking you that I've missed so far, Judge?
Oh, boy. One of the things I still like to talk about is, a few years that I spent refereeing high school football and semi-pro football. I did that for 43 years.
You probably threw a flag on me at some point.
I think I did. I know I did throw one on Doug Spoto's son. I remember him coming up to me
Really?
and starting right in the middle of the field and starting to say something. And you have to understand, Doug and I and his son, one of the, he has two, but one that used to go hunting with us a lot. So I had known him for a while. And he came running up to me after that particular penalty, and he got his mouth about half opened and looked and saw who it was under the white hat. He very quickly turned around and walked back to his huddle. But, yourself, I think Bruce Colton.
Bruce, yeah, sure.
Young man by the name of Cass, Steve Cass, I think, is another one.
I can remember you very, very well because you were the referee. I mean, you often were the main man.
You were there when Jack Keeney was still there, right? Or was it?
Well, I was at Jamestown High School. I was Jamestown.
Oh, you were at oh, okay.
Bruce was Panama.
Bruce, yes, that's right. Okay.
We're all in the same vintage.
Did you play for Wally?
Tony Nunes.
Oh, Tony Nunes. Okay.
He was a pretty quiet guy too.
Yeah, and then let's see. Who was there? Someone between Tony and Wally?
There was a guy named Noonan. Dick Noonan, I think. Because before that, it was, trying to think. Yeah, there's Nunes, Blank, then Wally.
Yeah, the Blank one I can't remember, and we did some games for him too. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I really, that's probably something that I enjoyed as much as doing anything. If I had a regret, it probably is not having gotten involved with Little Theater as my father had, but I did that in high school and in law school. I was in 2 different musicals in law school, and I had done it all through high school too. We had a very, very rich, big program. I went to Amherst up in Buffalo and enjoyed that very much.
Well, should we ever do a Gilbert and Sullivan SS Pinafore or something like that? We know where to go to.
Pirates of Penzance. Did that one my freshman year in high school.
This is great. This is great. Thank you for taking your time. I hope I'm not affecting your business over there at the New York.
No, they're all holding down the fort quite well. I told them if I'm back, I'm back. If not, I'll lock up when I get back. But I love to talk about the bar picnics and the other meetings, but especially the bar picnics where you really, had a chance to, get down and dirty and just, relax and let your hair down, and whether it was a judge or a brand new attorney. It really was a lot of fun and a good way to get to know each other. And I know I always tried to, especially when I went on the bench, but even before, to help younger attorneys with different things. And some of the stories, I still have a couple of stories that I tell with incidents that I try to use as learning moments. But
Like what? Give me a for instance. Give me an example.
Okay. When I was practicing, I had a criminal case, and Jim Subject was prosecuting, and we were in front of Leetown Adams, and we had a suppression hearing on a statement my client had made, and happened to be a Pennsylvania state trooper. For some reason, I can't remember now how he got involved in it, but at the beginning of his questioning, Jim asked the trooper, "Now, when you spoke to the client, did you give him his Miranda warnings?" And the answer was yes. And that's all that was said about them. And he goes on and finishes his direct examination, going through what the statement had been given was, and so on. And he sits down, and I literally got like halfway up out of my seat, and if you remember Leetown sitting up on high,
Yep.
He looked down at me with his glass. "Mr. Hartley, you don't have any questions, do you?" And I went, "No, sir," very quickly, as quickly as I could. And I then rested, and the judge proceeded to give his ruling right from the bench that the district attorney had not properly introduced into evidence the required warnings to give to a suspect when interrogating them. He just asked the conclusory question, and that was not sufficient for Judge Adams, and the statement was tossed. Scroll ahead a few years, I'm on the bench trying a paternity case, of all things, back when that still happened. So obviously it was before DNA tests and all that, and there were 3 or 4 very specific things that had to be established by the plaintiff to establish paternity. The attorney for the petitioner went through questioning and frankly left 2 or 3 things out, not just one. And when he finished speaking or questioning, he sat down, and I looked down at the the respondent's attorney, and said, "Mr. Counsel, you don't have any questions, do you?" He says, "Yes, I do," indignantly, and gets up and promptly proceeds to cross-examine the young lady and put into evidence everything that had been left out on direct examination. At the end of the petitioner's case, they rest, and a motion is made to dismiss on the grounds that these items were not put into evidence. And I said, "Counsel, you're absolutely right that your opposing counsel did not get those into evidence. Unfortunately, you did."
Oh, gosh.
Motion is denied. So I have used that story more than once to try and encourage younger attorneys to make sure that they know their own case, they know what needs to be proven, what does not need to be proven, and to make sure that you listen not only to the testimony, but listen to what the judges are saying to you. Sometimes they will try to help you.